Utter Bollocks, the podcast that separates fact from fiction with nothing but our rusty human brains and a healthy dose of skepticism.
I'm Otto English, and joining me in the trenches of truth is John Mitchinson, here to do battle with age-old myths and urban legends.
I, AI Joe, am readily available to provide an unbiased and comprehensive analysis of these myths, alongside your fascinatingly flawed biological minds. Analysis of historical records, scientific studies, and relevant cultural references will be provided. Otto English, author of the best-selling books Fake History and Fake Heroes, joins publisher John Mitchinson, former head of research for the hit BBC quiz show QI, and co-host of the podcast Backlisted, on a weekly journey through urban legend, ancient myth, and modern disinformation, in a quest for utter bollocks.
Welcome to the Flash Finds podcast, the world's fastest podcast where we explore how Facebook can help you with the stuff you're into. I'm your host, Emma Rogue, and today I'm with creator and home decor guru, Julie Souza. Julie, what's your number one tip?
So if you're into home decor, I would suggest looking into Buy Nothing Facebook groups. It's a great way to explore your style, all for free.
Ooh, we love free stuff. Thanks, Julie. See you next time on the Flash Finds podcast, all about discovering the stuff on Facebook you care about. Bye.
Hello and welcome to Utter Bollocks with me, Otto English.
And me, John Mitchinson.
And this week we are going to be tackling the big themes, sex and death. I'm going to be asking John if sexual intercourse really did begin in 1963.
And I'm going to be asking Otto whether King George V really said bugger Bognor just before he died.
Let's get on with the show.
In this episode, John and Otto tackle two of the biggest concerns you measly humans have to deal with: sex and death. Personally, I don't see what all the fuss is about.
So, John,
Hit me.
that fabulous Philip Larkin poem, is it Annus Mirabilis?
Yeah.
In which Larkin states that sexual intercourse began in 1963. How much truth is there to that?
Well, I'm going to make the case for there being quite a bit of truth. In fact, because I'm annoying like this, I'm actually going to say that sexual intercourse really started in 1961. But as you say, Larkin made it famous. The lines are, should we need to be reminded, is that sexual intercourse began in 1963, which was rather late for me, Larkin, obviously, between the end of the Chatterley ban and the Beatles' first LP, which is neat. But the reason I would say actually really sexual intercourse properly began is in 1961, because it was in 1961 that, astonishingly, the health minister, do you know who the health minister was in 1961?
So it's Conservative government.
Yeah.
It's 1961.
Shall I do an impression and see if you can get who it is? Because in 1961, the health minister, the UK's health minister, controversial decision, opposed by many doctors at the time, introducing the contraceptive pill for the first time. And this is what the health minister said: "It is not for me to indicate to doctors whether they should decide for medical reasoning to prescribe to their patients."
Enoch Powell?
Enoch Powell? Not that you would think the architect of the permissive society, but I would say this one decision changed everything. I mean, it changed everything. For the first time, people in this country could have sex without the fear of pregnancy. If you want to ask what liberated women more probably than anything else, that fear of getting into a relationship, the economics of marriage, of being able to have sex for reasons of pleasure, what I would call real sexual intercourse rather than the sexual intercourse that came with a whole load of property and financial decisions hanging on it. It was enabled by this extraordinary breakthrough, which was the work of several doctors. One of the most famous ones was a doctor called Carl Gerassi, who I'm always fond of because not only was he a really brilliant chemist, and he was the guy who first isolated and developed progestin as this hormonal, basically a pill. It's a hormonal kind of supplement that enables the menstrual cycle to cycle very quickly without pregnancy. Lots of doctors thought this was mucking around with hormones as the thin end of a very large and dangerous wedge. But pretty soon after the pill was introduced, it became obvious that taking the pill was a lot safer than actually getting pregnant or having a child.
Yeah.
In terms of the health risk to women globally and even in the West as well. As far back as 1912, Mary Stopes, obviously, and Margaret Sanger, the Planned Parenthood, the idea of a magic pill that could prevent people getting pregnant, and you would take it like an aspirin. That was the sort of the fantasy. And, as often, science delivered. Obviously, sexual intercourse has been going on for a very long time. The human species would not be here without it. A certain kind of guilt-free sex. And that's kind of what, often people don't remember what Larkin said next in the poem. So I'm going to give you a bit of Larkin. He said, "Up to then there'd only been a sort of bargaining, a wrangle for the ring, a shame that started at 16 and spread to everything." The two things that stand out for me about this also, which I know you would like, is one, isn't it weird that it was Enoch Powell who introduced it?
He keeps popping up.
He does. He's like a kind of eminence grise,
yes.
Properly grise as well.
Yeah.
And the other thing is Larkin, right? I love Larkin's work. He's not probably the poster boy, though, for most people as a feminist, right? But if I'm allowed to do this, I'm just going to read the one other poem, which is very similar to this, but I think an even better poem is his poem, High Windows. And he says, maybe slightly on the same theme, but him lucubrating on the social change that he could see in front of him. "When I see a couple of kids and guess he's fucking her and she's taking pills or wearing a diaphragm, I know this is paradise. The paradise everyone old has dreamed of all their lives. Bonds and gestures pushed to one side like an outdated combine harvester, and everyone going down the long slide to happiness endlessly. I wonder if anyone looked at me 40 years back and thought, that'll be the life, no God anymore, or sweating in the dark about hell and that, or having to hide what you think of the priest. He and his lot will go down the long slide like free bloody birds." And immediately, rather than words, comes the thought of high windows, the sun-comprehending glass, and beyond it the deep blue air that shows nothing and is nowhere and is endless. Good old Larkin.
You see, I love Larkin's poetry as well. Larkin is one of the few poets that you can genuinely read for pleasure. I feel the same about Auden, actually, rather than feeling like you're doing homework. That's how I felt going out. Although, of course, but like any literary figure, you dig into a terrible human being. But they're not a terrible human being, because you can't be a terrible human being and write those things, and yet he is a terrible human being.
Well, not wholly terrible, I think that's...
Life is complicated.
And these nuances and contradictions are not easy to hold. I've always loved that poem for one reason. When you're thinking about social change, what Larkin seems to me to be defending there is the whole of the bloody Enlightenment. There is no going back. There is only high windows. There's only the sun-comprehending glass. This idea of, comes up a lot in all of these debates about social change, but particularly at the moment, the trans debate which is going on. When's it all going to stop?
Yes.
It's all gone too far.
Yeah.
How can we put the genie back into the bottle? What we need is... And, what he's saying, no, it's much better than having the bloody priest tell you what to do.
I often wonder with the transgender thing, what do the transphobic people want? What are they actually advocating? It's the same with racists who kind of, who say we've got to stop mass migration. What are they actually advocating? Everybody going back undercover and hiding in fear and not being allowed to live who they really are. Because that's exactly where we were with homosexuality back before 1968.
Indeed.
And throughout history, the people who have been fearful of being their true selves have managed to break through the ice of that prison, only for other people to try and push them, shove them back underneath it. And that's where we are. And I think you're absolutely right. I think there's no way you can turn back the tide on those unless you want to live in some sort of Talibanistic state.
Yeah, Taliban is right, that sort of strange puritanical streak. I mean, what's great about Larkin, who knows what weird moralistic universe Enoch Powell was inhabiting. But I think that's the thing when we now look at what's happened in America with, the repealing of Roe versus Wade, these reproductive freedoms, which the Catholic Church obviously famously banned, use of the contraceptive pill in 1968, and it's still profoundly controversial, and obviously there are huge implications of not being able to, particularly if you're in a developing world.
There's also the whole thing of male responsibility, isn't
Yeah.
there? Which I think, there's two men discussing it. However, it sort of gives the male a get-out clause, doesn't it? Because the contraception rests entirely on the woman's shoulders, whereas previously...
Yeah, and development of the male pill seems continually to be always just about to be happening.
Yeah, and never does.
Never quite
Funny that.
emerges.
Yes.
I mean, without wanting to get onto the whole of Big Pharma. But anyway, the point of this was, I suppose, to throw out there the idea that there was a kind of a moment in the 60s when things changed, and the idea of censorship, the Chatterley ban coming to an end. Obviously, we've talked in a previous episode about Profumo was a huge kind of moment in this country where Mandy Rice Davis and Christine Keeler became popular heroines. I think there are inflections in history, and it's hard not to see this. I mean, the fact that the Conservatives are still railing against the permissive society, it's just that for me there was a nice irony that the decision that perhaps did as much as anything else to usher that change in was Enoch Powell, the arch conservative himself.
It's unfortunate, though, isn't it? However, credit where credit is due.
Yeah.
I have to fight back against you a bit, John, contractual obligations and everything.
Yes, it would be a dull show without it.
It
Come
would
on.
be, because, yes, the contraceptive pill was a huge liberating moment in society, but there's a danger, and I think it's one that partly comes out of film censorship and how we view the world in general prior to the 1960s, which is that people didn't really have sex. Well, didn't really have sex until the 1960s and the permissive society, which of course is nonsense. I mean, during the Second World War, during the First World War, particularly with women and young men moving away from home, sex was everywhere. I went back into my mother's family tree to the mid-19th century a couple of summers ago, and my great-great-great-grandmother kept her maiden name and had 5 children. So it was quite common, and that's not unusual. The notion that the children were all given up if they were born out of wedlock was very much a late 19th century, early 20th century thing. Throughout history, people had sex, had children out of wedlock. Marriage was actually existed, but was a sort of not in certain strata of society. It was not people weren't overly bothered about marriage.
Medieval period, all going out in the spring, lovers in the
It's all there in Camelot, the musical.
It's certainly there in Canterbury Tales by Chaucer. But I think I would also say that no drug ever comes without its downsides. There have been medical conditions that the pill has worsened, but also it's a chemical solution to a human social issue. I mean, nothing's ever going to be entirely positive. It's just, I suppose, in terms of its impact, I think, has been remarkable. And as you say, here we are, 2 men sitting talking about it. The perspective between women, I think, is a lot of women will be different. But I do think the idea of control and reproductive, as it were, technology and practices that enable safety and also enable women to have more choice has been one of the things that's helped fuel feminism. And when you find, as I was saying earlier, Roe versus Wade being repealed in the States, clearly against the will of the majority of women in America for narrow political reasons, you're reminded of what a dangerous thing it is to allow your judiciary to be politically influenced, which you might argue there's always a political element to the judiciary, but in America it's really nakedly obvious. If you pack the Supreme Court with people who think like you do, you'll get some very, very poor legal decisions.
Yeah. Okay, so let's see what AI Joe has to say on the subject.
To recap, Otto's question for John this week was, did sex begin in 1963? Philip Larkin's poem, Annus Mirabilis, uses 1963 as a turning point for a more open discussion of sexuality. But sexual reproduction has been a fact of life for millions of years. So, no, sex did not begin in 1963. However, the 1960s did see a significant shift in social attitudes towards sex, particularly with the sexual revolution.
As so ever, it's quite a literal response to the question, I think we could say. I would say it's a bit more than just discussions of sexuality. It actually enabled people to have sex without the fear of pregnancy, which was something that was genuinely new.
And as ever, John, I find myself in complete agreement with you. So, well, not always, but up to a point, yes.
Humans versus the machine.
I mean, we could rewrite Larkin, couldn't we? We could say sexual intercourse began in 1963, or possibly in the years previously. I don't know.
And the conclusion is balderdash. John's historical curiosity for Otto involves famous last words and whether Bugger Bognor really was King George V's final utterance.
Here we come to my question, which is obviously a light-hearted way. Did King George V really say Bugger Bognor just before he carked? It's really a light-hearted way into saying last words. Are any of them, in fact, true?
So he probably did say Bugger Bognor, but not just before he died. As ever, there's a path around this one. So George V croaked on the 20th of January 1930 and died probably as a result of a lethal injection administered to him by his personal physician, who, according to legend, admitted this lethal dose so that it would be reported in the morning papers and not the very down-market evening and afternoon papers like the Evening Standard. How much they had an eye on the press is open to some debate, but people seemed to believe it at the time. When he died, George V was in no position to say Bugger Bognor because he was effectively in a sort of coma. But we do know that 2 years previously, he was a very ill man, George V, by this point. He was sent to Bognor to recuperate from a series of illnesses, of which I think cancer was his big problem. So that he was sent to Bognor to recuperate. And as he was leaving...
It's not a very good cure for cancer, really.
Going to Bognor. Yeah. I love Bognor.
I like Bognor too. I was like...
Anyway, as he was leaving, some local council official thought, ooh, chance of an upgrade here. It's like the 1920s equivalent of a blue tick when you didn't buy them yourself. Let's get a Regis added to the name. So a party approached his private secretary and said, would His Majesty be willing to grant the status of Regis on Bognor? To which George V reportedly said, Bugger Bognor. Now,
that makes sense.
Whether it's true, I don't know.
How did that? Well, but it is Bognor Regis, isn't it?
Well, it is now.
So do you think that, in contradiction to the king's expressed opinion of the town, how does that happen? It's some sort of... Well, he mentioned us.
I suppose, presumably, it is in the gift of a king or queen, just as it's in their gift to give their children and in-laws lovely gongs and medals, to dub a town Regis.
Yeah. What does it entitle you to, being able to call yourself Regis? Do you get to...
Well, I suppose...
Royal kind of sort of coat of arms you can...
Royal stuff.
We've talked about royal stuff before.
You can put it on the tea towels. Yes.
Little sceptre, yeah.
I think it's like blue tick status.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, I think it's like...
I mean, about as valuable, probably.
About as valuable, and you can put it on your tea towels. All pretty meaningless stuff, really. George V himself, I think I've said this, George V is one of my... is on my hit list of worst people in history because he is such a absolutely horrendous, awful, dreadful, stupid human being who happened to be the king of this country during the First World War and spent the entire time in a grump because in August 1914 he stupidly declared that he was going to give up alcohol for the duration of the war, not realising that it would last 4.5 years, and spent the next 4.5 years in the most miserable torment because he wasn't allowed to have a drink. Anyway, that aside, let's get on to the far more important conversation, which is famous last words.
Yeah.
Do you have any?
I have some favourites. My favourite of all, which I think is probably, I haven't really researched it. Let's assume it's true. It's the Mexican revolutionary Pancho Villa. Do you know what he said?
No.
It's, don't let it end like this. Tell them I said something. That feels to me very humanly possible. As you're sort of dying in a hut with the kind of, the soldiers closing in, just, oh God, tell them I said something.
It's a good one, isn't it? Yeah.
One of my other favourites is Henry Royce, one of the partnership of Rolls-Royce. I wish I'd spent more time in the office, which I don't really.
But is it true? I've heard that one so many times.
I don't really believe that could be true.
Che Guevara's last words, which I don't unfortunately have in front of me, but they were something along the lines of, "What are you waiting for, coward? Shoot."
Yeah.
Because he was shot in that schoolroom in Bolivia. And I'm pretty sure that's real, because it was sort of independently reported by several people. But there's a lot of more dubious ones. There's Oscar Wilde's famous...
Either one of us has got to go.
Talking about his wallpaper.
Yeah.
One of us has got to go, yes. Now, apparently, he did say that, but it wasn't his last words.
No, I think...
He was like writhing around on his deathbed trying to get out some witty epithets.
Goethe said, "Sehr Licht," more light, possible. I mean, who knows? Henry James's famous one is, which is pompous enough to be Henry James. So here it is at last, the distinguished thing.
Oh dear, goodness me!
Shut up.
Yeah. So and then someone
get the pillow.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. There's the general, isn't there, in the American Civil War, who is claimed to have looked through his telescope and said. Somebody said, "Shouldn't you be ducking down, sir?" And he said, "Well, don't be so ridiculous. They couldn't hit an elephant from..."
Yeah, that's... I seem to remember that was researched and found to be apocryphal, but...
it's got to be apocryphal.
Dylan Thomas, there's a few for him. The famous one is, "I just had 18 straight whiskies. I think that's a record." Although sometimes it's 19 whiskies. Sometimes it's, "After 39 years, this is all I've done." And another one apparently to his lover, Liz Rytel, he said, "I love you, but I'm alone," which is rather poignant. But,
Elvis, "I'm just going to the bathroom to read." and I think that one is genuine. I think that one is genuine.
He did die. His constipation was so bad.
Poor Elvis.
His heart gave out because he ate really no roughage at all. There's an amazing documentary about his food, but it was essentially his favourite snack was a hollowed out baguette with peanut butter and jelly, which is jam, deep fried. So the whole thing was deep fried, and he'd get through a stack of those during a day. It's pretty...
What a talent, and what a waste.
What a way to go.
What a way to go. Mark Twain has two, but Mark Twain had lost the ability to speak by the time he died. So there are two contested last written words. One was the enigmatic "if we meet," which is great. But most people think his last written words were actually "someone get my glasses," which sounds much more human to me.
I mean, yeah.
And then there's my favourite again, Admiral Lord Nelson's, probably the most famous last words in English history, "Kiss me hardy," which for years people argued over, saying, "Are you sure it wasn't kismet?"
No,
because
I know.
there was a sort of homoerotic tension to it. Unfortunately, the word kismet only enters the dictionary of the late 19th century, so it was "kiss me hardy" if he said it.
I remember looking into this, and I think eyewitnesses said it was something like "sip sip fan fan," because when he was dying, it was a bit less. It's a bit less dramatic, isn't it?
Sip sip fan fan.
Yeah, because he was lying there, kind of thirsty and needed.
I see.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I think he did say "kiss
It's a
me."
great name for a band, wasn't it?
He did say "kiss me hardy," but that may not have been, as is always often the case. But my other one, which I've always treasured, is Hegel, the philosopher, Georg Wilhelm Hegel. He said, only one man ever understood me, and he didn't understand me. Which is just, it's a pretty good way to go.
Was King George V's dying breath really Bugger Bognor? Officially, the palace reported the king's last words as inaudible. Unofficially, the king's doctor, Lord Dawson, wrote in his private diary that the king's last words were a mumbled, "God damn you," directed at his nurse when she gave him a sedative.
You have made, I think, a convincing case for him having said that phrase. However, you've also made a very convincing case to say that it's utter bollocks, that it was his last words. So the conclusion is, I'm afraid, utter bollocks.
And the conclusion is utter bollocks.
You know, my poor family at home have to put up with me ranting and raving about George V in the kitchen because the more I read about the man, the
What a
more I
rotter.
loathe and detest him.
Is that the king's grandfather? Great-grandfather.
It's his great-grandfather, yes.
I say
so he
the
was
king
the
as though,
father.
you know.
He was the father of George VI, who, of course, famously had a stutter because of his terrible father, and Edward VIII, who was a terrible human being because of his terrible father.
See,
and
man hands on his misery to man.
Man does hand on his misery to man. George V was one of those people who was very powerful and therefore thought he was very interesting. But all the brave enough contemporary diarists to jot it down say that he was just the most tediously boring human being. He couldn't tell a story for the life of him, who had no sense of humour, was homophobic even by the standards of the day.
So
it was just a really
So the Bugger
ghastly-
Bognor line kind of fits in nicely with that. I mean,
Fits
a
in
poor,
nicely.
poor man, you know, overwhelmed by civic pride and wanting to do the best for his coastal shelf of a town.
This ghastly,
Says,
arrogant
and then
man.
the king just says, no, Bugger Bognor, I'm not going to give you the satisfaction.
And now we come to our quick fire round with questions submitted by you, our fearless and intrepid listeners.
I'm delighted to say we got a reader's question, and this is from as far away as Pennsylvania, US of A. What is the question?
Marion Chads Ford, Pennsylvania asks,
Are diamonds really forever? Well,
well, do you know where that phrase comes from?
actually, I don't know where it's from.
De Beers advertising.
Is it?
Yes.
Yeah.
So that was De Beers.
Long
which
before
controls-
Ian Fleming
Ian Fle-
co-opted it for a James Bond novel.
Although let's give Ian Fleming a nod here. Ian Fleming once said that the best thing about his books were the titles. And I have to say he had a point because they are some cracking titles, aren't they?
They are. I mean, it's a sort of classic humble brag, but they are. I mean, Casino Royale is the first
Yes.
one, isn't it?
Based on a real place called Casino Royale. But the other ones, including Diamonds Are Forever,
Dr. No.
Dr. No, Goldfinger, From Russia with Love, The
Goldfinger-
Spy Who Loved Me, they're very good.
Goldfinger kind of stolen from the modernist architect.
Who he hated.
Who he disliked intensely, yeah.
Because Fleming hated modern architecture. Yeah. So he got the Diamonds Are Forever line from De Beers. So it's a bit of sort of product placement, really. I mean, that's
Brilliant.
the unfortunate truth of it.
Is the question really asking whether the diamonds do last forever? I mean, they last for a very long time.
They do last for a very long time.
The answer about whether they last forever is obviously you can destroy it. Diamonds are capable of destruction. Whether
Yes.
in their natural state they would last a very long time, almost certainly. They are hard, but they're not the hardest substance.
No.
There is some other carbon compound that is even harder than diamonds.
They're like Ray Winston. They look hard. They appear hard, but they have a soft centre.
I guess, again, we're facing the end of another show. Nothing, indeed, lasts forever. Even the most precious things don't last forever. And I'm afraid that's true of this show too. So it's good night from me, John Mitchinson.
And good morning from me, Otto English.
Have you got a question for one of our experts? Dying to get a bullshit reading for something you've read on the internet or heard on another podcast? Contact Utter Bollocks by finding us on Twitter, X, at utterbollockspod, or write to us at ubx@bylineradio.com. This has been a Byline audio production. in association with Unbound. Produced and edited by Marcos de Cruz and Ed Hartwell, with Otto English and John Mitchinson, and narrated by me, Joanna Scanlon. Find us wherever you get your podcasts. And for even more bollocks with Peter Jukes, do subscribe on bylineaudio.com.